are going to begin on our 10-minute cherry blossom tree painting here in the sky with a large square-headed brush and some titanium white. I'm going to begin by very quickly, very roughly blocking in a lot of it and even extending it past where I want the sky to be. That way I can take portions of that white and blend it in with the edges of all of my trees, and this is going to add a lot of light and dimension to those trees. So very quickly, because acrylic paint does dry quickly, I'm then taking a pink, which is a mixture of my primary red and titanium white. I'm working in an X-shaped pattern, and I'm trying to blend it and just get it on the canvas. I'm not worried about the stroke type itself. I'm not worried about the harsh edges because I'm going to go back with another brush later and fix all of that up. Right now, I'm just trying to get a healthy blend from one to the other and ensure that I have a good transition from a white to a pink to a darker pink to a darker pink, right? So this is really just a base layer, and I'm being so quick with it. I'm using the large square-headed brush because acrylic paint does dry quickly, and this is something we need to do kind of in one motion, right? We can't wait for anything to dry. So as you can see, I'm just continuing to work all of that around everywhere and applying darker pinks to the center areas that are farther away from the light. Then I'm taking a small, old, square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in all of these different directions, and I'm using a dabbing effect to render a myriad of little petals, right, or implied petals. These are very far away, so you're not going to see them exactly, and they're going to be kind of represented in this dot-like shape here. So as you can see, we're turning that very rough, very harsh-edged edge around all of these trees and light to something very soft, and it's this gradual gradation from the light to the trees, and it's really beautiful. So I'm happy we were able to do that in the time that we were. Then I'm going to take a very small square-headed brush with some burnt umber, a mixture of pink, and a good amount of water. And I'm going to apply a litany of little trees on the edges of my forest here. When I'm working in the background, I'm being much more subtle with my application. It's much softer. And when I'm working in the foreground, I'm applying much more pressure with my brush. What this is going to do is ensure that my lines are a lot sharper in the foreground and that the color is a little bit more dense. Whereas in the background, when I'm not using as much pressure, it's blending more with the pigment that's already on the canvas, and it's getting kind of a feathered edge because it's not being pressed hard into the canvas, right? So through this, all of my trees in the background are going to be very soft, and all of my trees in the foreground are going to be a lot harder, and the color is going to be much more prominent, which is really, really good for instilling depth. From there, I'm going to still use that same small square-headed brush, this time with more water, and I'm going to begin branching off in varying directions. And so, as you can see, I'm reapplying additional paint because, of course, the paint will blend with that initial layer and we're going to have to go back and re-layer. But also, as I move my branches upwards, I'm ensuring that they kind of arch over the painting. And this way, when a viewer looks at it, their eyes are going to go to the light areas. And if they follow the tree upwards, their eye isn't going to be led off the painting, right? It's going to follow a branch that leads into another tree that leads back into the painting. So we're trying to lead the viewer's eye throughout our painting via our branches. And if you're finding you have a difficult time rendering small, very sharp branches, I would implore you to use more water in your mix. It's going to make them look a little bit more transparent, but that's okay because the base is going to look very strong and the transition might look very nice. So with that being said, I'm not only going to apply these branches to my larger trees, but also my smaller ones. And when I apply too much paint, I'm just going to use my finger to mitigate that amount. As you can see, I'm trying to kind of create this canopy, this ceiling of petals and of all of our foliage. So you get this very magical effect, right? And I'm applying all of these in arcing motions over our areas. However, it's important to keep these arches diverse. So as you can see, I'm getting fairly loose with my stroke, and that way I ensure not everything's going to look the same. One of the worst things you can do in a forest painting is make every tree look exactly the same as the one next to it. So you do want to instill as much diversity as you can. So the trees aren't done. However, I need to let them dry before I can add my highlights and my petals in the foreground. So what we're going to do in the meantime is go down to work on the rocks. And these rocks, right now, aren't going to have any detail. They're not going to have any light or shadows. They are simply going to be a base color and show me where I want my rocks to be. So I'm using a fairly small square-headed brush because it can render sharp edges, and that's important when you're rendering rocks because they can't have soft edges, right? And I'm just putting down this base layer and kind of crafting my rocks in the general shapes that I want them to be. Again, you don't want too many similar shapes, but they are rocks, so they are going to be similar to an extent. I'm then moving over to the other side, and as you can see and notice, when the rocks are much farther away, I'm painting them to be much smaller. When the rocks get much closer to us, we are rendering them much larger. And of course, that's just because that's how depth works. When things are very far away, they look a lot smaller. So our trees in the background are very soft and are very small. Our rocks in the background are very soft and very small. I'm going to let those dry before I add on my highlights and shadows. And while I do that, I'm going to work in the water area down here. I'm using a little bit of a larger square-headed brush and working in horizontal strokes. I'm blending to a point my brush into the rocks on the side, and that's because I want to take a bit of this gray and blend it out. This is going to act as a shadow and as a reflection from our rocks a little bit later on. So rather than painting our water and then worrying about painting the reflection, I'm just doing it all at once. And it's going to save a lot of time and make things very natural and easy. So again, I'm just trying to do that very softly. I'm not trying to bring the gray very far out, but just enough. And as you can see, the pink is blending with it to a point, which is going to be a very nice subtle effect, right? So from there, I'm taking some titanium white, applying it to the background where my light is emanating from, and moving it forward in horizontal strokes. Now, of course, this paint is going to be, what we're working on is still very wet, right? So it's going to blend. So the more paint you have on your brush, the more white you will get, and the lighter your stroke and application, the more pure white you'll get. The more you try to force it and blend it, the more it'll turn into something kind of gray, which happened to me to a point there in the foreground, as you can see. But we can wait for that to dry and then remedy it very, very easily. So with that being said, I'm now taking my small square-headed brush and applying the highlights to my rocks. I'm doing this with the square-headed brush because it has sharp edges, and of course, again, our rocks need to be sharp. I'm only applying highlights to the edges of the rocks that are going to be receiving light, and I'm not overdoing it. I don't want the highlights of my rocks to be as light as the light itself, right? So it's important to keep that balance and remember where you want your real light to be coming from, what you want it to be. You save your brightest brights and your darkest darks for very specific subjects. So now I'm taking a good amount of white and I'm softening all of the rocks in the background because there is so much light emanating from the background. So as you can see, now we have this real transition from very bright rocks in the background to these darker, starker ones here in the foreground. And I'm just trying to create varying effects within these rocks and keep them different. Then, as we're running out of time, I'm taking that same brush that I used earlier for the petals, and I'm dabbing on very light pink into the sky area, or rather into the tops of our trees. And these are just going to be very bright additional petals that are going to add a lot of depth and a lot of highlight. Now, you can use a pure white, but I would advise you to use a very, very light pink. It's up to you, but as I move down, I'm softening all of the petals and ensuring that they aren't as dark. I'm applying less pressure with my brush. There we have our painting at about 10 minutes, but as per usual, I did cheat. I did take an extra 3 or 4, and I just wanted to show you what I did with those. So I continued to add a litany of additional petals, and I softened the ones in the background. Then what I'm going to do is take a small square-headed brush with a good amount of water and reincorporate some of those branches we worked on top of, and reapply them over some of the leaves. I want the branches to kind of be intertwining in and out of all of the petals, and it's just going to give it a much more three-dimensional effect. Then I'm taking a lot of white, a large round-headed brush, and a lot of water, and I'm creating a mist by applying a fairly transparent layer, then blending it out with my fingers, predominantly in a horizontal motion. This is going to give it a kind of mystical and fantasy effect. Something really, really beautiful. I love mist in paintings. So finally, I'm going to add a couple of light rays coming from the top. I'm beginning with a titanium white and some water. Then with my finger, I'm dragging the pigment down. This is going to create a gradient from a pure white at the top to something fairly transparent and just a really nice accent to the piece. So there we have it, with the exception of our water. We still need to fix that. So now I'm just taking a little bit of white and I'm creating a border between the rocks and the gray reflections. And it's amazing what that can do. So there's our final piece. I truly hope you've enjoyed. I had a lot of fun and I hope you did too. If you'd like to know more, of course, there's a link in the description to my book, Acrylic Painting for Beginners, and I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and above all, stay creative.